Hey, it's Colleen. Welcome back to my sewing room. So today I'm back with another sewing project. This time it's a 1920s day dress. This is the Welmade Dress. It's a reproduction of an antique garment that's part of the Plus Pattern project on an exhibition that's currently online at the museum at FIT website. I'm going to insert a clip here to tell you more about the exhibition and the project. The Roaring 20s and the Swinging 60s is a virtual exhibition by the museum at FIT and the Graduate Studies Department. It was created by a team of graduate students, and it explores the similarities in fashion between the two decades. The exhibition showcases garments from the museum's collection, and it takes a look at the cultural and political influences on the fashions of the times. It also includes the Plus Pattern project, which features 5 dress patterns taken from extant 1920s dresses. The pattern for my dress was taken from a day dress from the second half of the 1920s. It was made by the Welmade Company, which produced dresses in a larger size range that were sold at between $25 and $60. Compared to another dress in the exhibition, which was sold at under $1, this was a high-end dress, and it shows in the complexity of the construction. There are 4 other dress patterns that are part of the Plus Pattern project. Don't miss this wonderful exhibition, and be sure to download and try out those free patterns. I was a pattern tester for the Welmade dress, and I think I was the first one to actually finish a full dress, so I did not have the benefit of other people going before me. That being said, I know there were mistakes, and in fact, the day that the exhibition opened is when I released my pictures. It's also when there was a video released from Maria at Historical Garments giving a lot of detail on this particular dress. And that's how I knew I had made mistakes, because I could see what she was doing and I was like, oh, that's how that works. So definitely go and check out her excellent video. I'm going to link it in the description box down below. If you are thinking about making this dress, you will not want to miss her tutorial. It's really, really beneficial. Anyway, this video is not so much a step-by-step tutorial as it is just a summary of my experience as a pattern tester on this dress. It is the most complicated of the 5 dresses that are available at the exhibition. They all have free PDF patterns, of course, so you don't want to miss those if you're into the 1920s or if you want to experiment with some historical costumes. There's not a lot of detail, and so you have to have a certain skill level to be able to do this dress. You can't do this as a beginner, because I still struggled with it and I've got a lot of years of sewing under my belt. As I said, this is the second of 2 videos on the 1920s. In that video, I go through some backstory about how I came to be a pattern tester for this project, and I talk a lot about some of the fit issues I experienced as a very curvy hourglass figure trying to adapt to a 1920s more straight up and down silhouette. So make sure you watch that first video. I'll link it. Nope, it's always over here. I'll link it up here for you to go and watch that video. You can take a look at some of the pattern modifications that I made, which I had to make on this dress as well. But anyway, I made mistakes. That's part of being a pattern tester, and I'm looking forward to showing the process to you. I actually had footage of all of the fitting and mock-up process and lost it somehow. The computer ate it, I don't know. But the good news is I still actually have my mock-ups. And so I wanted to show you an error that I made in the early stages of putting this together and testing the pattern. And thank goodness I was able to correct it before I went on to my fashion fabric. So I'm going to explain to you what it was, because it could save you from making the same mistake. This pattern has several vertical lines, and those vertical lines are used to make a box pleat, one on each side of the front of the dress. And there's also a dart right here. This dart needs to be sewn before you make the box pleats. That's one mistake that I made. And then the second thing is there's only 1 box pleat per side. And on the first time I made this, I made 2. So I made my mock-up, I pressed everything, I was so excited, and I went to bed that night thinking I had cracked the code, solved the puzzle, and realized the next morning, hey, something's not right. And I went and looked at the original picture, and of course there's 1 box pleat. So this is how it's supposed to look. 1 box pleat instead of 2. This is actually really interesting looking, and it could be a design choice, but that's not how it was intended. That's not how the pattern was drawn. So if you wanted to go this route, feel free, but you might run into some problems when you go to cut the pieces out later on, because what you do is you make the box pleats and then lay the pattern on top of here and trace out a new cutting line to make your final pattern piece for the dress. So anyway, don't make 2 box pleats unless you want to. The dress is only supposed to have 1. Another thing I had to do was to put a dart in. In my last video, I went through a lot of detail about why I needed to put a dart in here. So I'm not going to bother recreating it on this video. Just go watch the last one and you'll understand. But I had to put a dart in the underwaist and in the dress itself in order to accommodate a larger bust. So that is the mock-up. Once I got this part figured out, I was able to move on with the rest of the dress. This is the underwaist for the Welmade dress. This is just a really lightweight, kind of sheer cotton. See my hand through it. I did not French the darts to the outside. I just did them like a traditional dart where they're facing to the inside. This is the trim around it. I just used some seam binding that I had in my stash. And they called for 1/4 inch trim, but I just used the seam binding. And you can see here are darts I added in the arm side to accommodate my bust. The original called for a 1/2 inch rolled hem. I just used seam binding on the bottom as well. So the most interesting thing and the most fiddly thing about this is this placket for the hooks and eyes. And I honestly don't understand why they would have gone through the trouble of doing this. So the hooks and eyes are sandwiched in between these folds, which makes for a really nice finish. Up here I have actually attach them together, and you can see how everything is hidden nice and neat underneath that little placket, and on the inside it's also hidden nice and neat, but they are hard to do up. And it was a lot of hand sewing to get them situated correctly and to recreate the original, and I just don't really see the purpose. I think the point was to have a little bit of a modesty, so in case you had a gap with your hooks and eyes, but you're going to have a stomacher that goes over this. There is a line here where it will be sewn onto one side and then snapped over on the other, so you wouldn't be able to see anything anyway. So anyway, I did it, but honestly, if I had it to do over again, I would have just done a more traditional closure because it was just a pain. The other thing, I have mystery red marks showing up on my stuff. I don't know where that's coming from. I'm not using any red ink. I don't have any red drinks back here, and I am not bleeding. So I don't know, but this kind of red stuff has shown up in a few spots. I had 4 yards of this mystery fabric that I bought at a thrift store. I did a burn test, and the results indicate that it's an all-natural fiber, probably with some cotton or linen. But when I pressed it, it smelled a lot like wool, so clearly it's a blend of some kind. This fabric drapes really well, and it holds a nice crease. I'm happy with it. Plus, it uses something up from my stash. I mentioned in my pattern marking video that you have to adapt your marking method to the fabric and the project that you're working on. So this fabric, it's got a herringbone, it's got 3 different colors, there's a red stripe in there. It's impossible to see any kind of wax paper or even chalk for that matter. It's not so easy to see on here. So I'm going to go ahead and thread trace my stitching lines and a dart so that I can make sure that those are transferred accurately. And the nice thing about doing thread tracing is it'll get both sides of this front piece at the same time. Thread tracing worked to a degree. I think what was best was that I thread traced it enough to see where the lines were, and then I went over them with chalk. So now it's really easy to see, but it was way easier to do it that way than it was to try and lift and manipulate the paper and try and chalk along. So I'm really struggling with this fabric. I marked it yesterday, and I had a hard time finding my spots again today. It's really hard to see, and then it kind of does this weird thing that the longer you look at it, the more cross-eyed you get. So it looks fine and innocent right there, but it's kind of tough. So anyway, I think I found them, but probably when I cut out the back piece, I'm going to try to use like green thread or something, another color besides yellow, because I wish I had different fabric. But this is what I've got, and so I'm working with it. I think it's going to be nice in the end if I can ever get it sewn up. So anyway, now I'm sewing the box pleats in the front. I pressed them. That's the only good thing, is I can see that I'm sewing in the valley of where I pressed it, and that's about all I got. I learned from the first one, and instead of thread tracing the fold lines, I decided to only thread trace the stitching line. So that ended up, reducing my work quite a bit, and I was able to use a blue chalk, and I don't even know, I don't think you can see that very well on screen, but the blue chalk is far easier for me to see. And now all I have to do is match up the chalk marks on either side, and that will be my stitching line. And then I did clip into the seam allowance for where my fold needs to be so I can get the box pleat the right width. There you go. That was much faster. So now I'm going to stitch this shoulder seam. The original only had 1/4 inch seams, which is kind of interesting. There are snaps to close on the left-hand side, and I just don't think that's necessary because this can get pulled over the head. It's got a huge V-neck in the front and it's slit down to like right here, and I just can't see why you would even need to bother with the snaps. So I'm going to stitch it for now, and if I can pull it over my head, I think on mine I'm just going to skip that detail. I think that'll be okay. I would rather not have the extra bulk of, more layers of fabric and a placket and all of that on the side. The other thing I'm going to do is serge this. This fabric is kind of a looser weave and it will ravel. Well, it looks like a potato sack, unfortunately. It's just like on the other 1920s dress. I've got a ton of extra material right here. It's just the way my body is built. My waist is the smallest part of me. In order to get something to fit here and here, I end up with just this huge chunk right here to take out. So I think I can still taper this in by several inches and still have a very 1920s look without all the extra bulk. And you can see right here, this is what it does on my body. It just kind of collapses in on itself in that part. So I'm not going to worry about it yet. I'm going to put the sleeves on the under thing. I'm going to put on the collar and the facing right here so that this part's done. I'm going to iron down those pleats before I take it in on the sides because I just want to be sure. But yeah, it's big. But look at the back. The back lays really nicely. These pleats are really classy looking. So that'll be okay for sure. But the sides just are way too big. And so I've got to figure out how to give that a little more flattering shape. And I can't imagine a 1920s lady would have been happy with that either. Now we come to the next big mistake I made, the collar. I don't have any footage of me putting this collar on because it was a lot of me standing around going, I'm not sure how this works. Why isn't this fitting in there? And the reason why is that it's on upside down. So this long edge was supposed to be next to the neck and the short edge was supposed to come out. So it was supposed to attach along here and then be a smooth line from here out to a point and then back up around. This is completely my mistake because if you look at the pattern piece, it's clear that this is the bottom of it and this is the top of it. So it should have gone around the neck like this. I missed it, and part of that was me thinking, oh, I know how to put on a collar, and the more maybe modern shape is to have this point coming out just like you see here, right? So that was an assumption that I made. I should have gone back and looked at the pictures, but there was only one picture available for quite some time, and I had looked at it a few times and just never looked at it again. My fault. So even if I had realized my mistake early, I would not have been able to fix this because by the time I noticed that I was having trouble, I had already top stitched around this, and this fabric cannot be seam ripped. You can't get it out because it will snag and tear. The other problem is I can't cut a new collar. I don't have any fabric left. I just don't have any. So I can't fix it even if I wanted to. Even if I had wanted to at the time, I could not have fixed it. I was kind of already down the path, and this is what we have. So does it look all right? Yes, I think it looks fine. I'm actually pretty okay with it, but it's not what the original dress was. If you're looking to make an exact replica, you need to put this collar piece on the other way. Here's a good reason why you should know when to stop. So a couple days ago, I was working on this dress and my neck started hurting and I started getting tired, and I thought, oh, all I have to do is just bind these armholes and then I can stop for the night. So I made my binding and I sat down and happily sewed it on to the wrong side of the garment. So this should have been on the outside, and then you flip it to the inside for a nice clean finished edge. And instead, I sewed it to the inside, which means it would flip to the outside, and that absolutely is not going to work. This fabric is miserable for trying to remove a seam. It frays, and it's hard to see the stitches. You can't get your seam ripper in there without it pulling the threads of the fabric. This is really thin. The binding material is super, super, super thin. So I'm going to just cut it and leave it stitched and sew another piece of binding on there. But first I have to make the binding again because I don't have enough to do both armholes with what's left. So it's a bit of a drag, but that's what happens when you do things you shouldn't do. This is the reason why we use bias tape instead of like a straight piece of fabric, is because when you flip it around and press it, it will stretch around the curves and lay nice and flat. So there's no puckering in this binding as it goes around the curves of the armscye. It might be tempting to finish the bias binding by machine, but just go ahead and do it by hand. It doesn't take that long. And the stitch that you see me doing here is the felling stitch. It's my new favorite stitch. It looks so clean and it's really easy to do. You can see in this light a couple of little puckers where the stitches are. You cannot see that in person. And then here's what it looks like on the inside. Just a nice, neat, finished edge. So remember, the sleeves on this dress are attached to the underwaist, is what they're calling it. So this is more like a jumper that will go over that under blouse that has the sleeves on it. And then there is another piece of fabric that goes on the underwaist that kind of covers this V. Obviously, you wouldn't wear that all the way down like that. That little pucker right there is not very flattering. The more I look at it, the more I hate that. But again, I think a good pressing will help that to lay flat. I would have preferred to see this dress not be cut on a fold. So that front centerpiece is cut on a fold, and then you slit it down to a certain point, sew in the facing, and stitch it back up to a certain point. And that's why you get that weird little pleat right there, because from here down, it's all one piece of fabric. If I were patterning it myself, I would have not chosen to do it that way. I would have just chosen to cut it as two separate pieces and run a seam down there. And it may be something that once I finish making it, I decide to go ahead and just take that tuck and sew it all the way down, because I hate that little pucker. But it may not look so bad once it's actually pressed and on, so, you know, we'll keep going. I have finished cutting out the rest of the pattern pieces. I probably should have done them all at once, but I wanted to make sure I could get the most important pieces cut exactly as they were supposed to be before I did the other things that I could maybe potentially get out of scraps. So now it's time for me to finish this underwaist with the arm guards, and this is what will like cover up this underwaist fabric, because the other dress is like a jumper, so there's no sleeves on the outside of it, and so as that shifts and moves, you don't want to see this light colored fabric, so this covers it up, and that's the way it was on the original garment. So my job now is to sew those on, to assemble the sleeves, and then attach those to the waistcoat. Then I'll make the stomacher, which covers this fabric under that long V-neck of the jumper, and then I'll make the belt. And I had just enough fabric. I mean just enough. There's nothing usable, no usable scraps left from my 4 yards of fabric, and I think my fabric, let's see. Yeah, so I had 58-inch wide fabric. I had 4 yards of it, and I've got nothing left, essentially. And as it was, I had to cut one of the belt pieces on the cross grain. So it shouldn't be noticeable because the fabric is kind of, it'll kind of hide that, I think. But yeah, it was a close call. It's time for sleeves, and I am terrified I'm going to screw them up. I don't have any fabric whatsoever to replace them. So I got to make sure that I get the two pieces, the upper sleeve and the under sleeve, put together correctly for each side. So you can't have the right sleeve made twice. You have to have a right sleeve and a left sleeve. And then I have cuffs, and there are two pieces for the cuff lining for each sleeve. and I have to figure out, I think I sew right sides together, turn it under, and then make a tuck. So that's what I'm going to work on next, and it's going to require every brain cell I have, I think. By the way, this fabric is the sheddingest, the loosest weave, most shedding fabric I've worked with in a while. It's not the worst I've ever worked with, but it's pretty bad. And the stuff is everywhere. So one of the jobs I'll have to do is pull out all of the basting threads, but also get rid of all of these little fuzzies that are literally everywhere. I'm going to have to clean my sewing room so bad after this. What I'm doing now, I've sewn the sleeves together. It looks like I got them right, which is good. So I just need to install them correctly, but that's the next step. For now, I've got the sleeve lining pinned to the sleeves on both sides. I'm going to stitch along the bottom and then turn it and iron it so that the edge of the cuff is finished and the lining is to the inside. So forget everything I just said. Because if I turn this now, then when I sew the sleeve, I'll have a raw edge. That complicates things quite a bit. I think what I'm going to do is press all this open and stitch the sleeves together and then turn it, and I'll have to figure out how to do that tuck with the sleeve in a tube. Okay, it's editing Colleen again to explain another mistake that I made, and it is the cuff. So the clip you just saw showed me wondering how in the world you're supposed to sew that without having a raw edge. So what I ended up doing was sewing it all into a tube and then flipping that piece inside like this, top stitching around there to make a tuck, and then you see this nice little, you know, detail, this fold on the outside of the fabric. And I thought, okay, well, I solved the problem and it's nice and neat. There's no raw edges. What I should have done, and I didn't know this until the video from Maria at Historical Garments came out, was that I should have left this seam here open and sewed it as a vent. So I should have sewn in the seam allowances or folded them in along here and only connected the sleeve from here up. And this tuck was supposed to be on the other side of the fabric. So if you're going to make this to be true to the pattern, this should be split along here, and then this tuck should be on the inside. And I think that actually would look really cool if you flipped it up and had that split. That could be a really neat thing, but I don't have that. So what I have is this nice, it's a pointed cuff, and it looks really nice and neat, and everything's encased, so it's not bad, but it's not accurate to the dress. And again, I have no fabric left to fix this. I can't pull it apart. I just can't fix it. Even if I had realized my mistake, I couldn't have fixed it once I had sewn the sleeve into a tube. So anyway, go look at Maria's video. It's much better than this, and she'll show you step by step how to take care of these. So I think another thing that I did that wasn't quite right was that the sleeve is attached to the arm guard, and then the whole assembly is attached to the underwaist. I put the arm guards on first and then attach the sleeves. So I don't think it makes a big difference, but it might give you a little more movement in the armscye if you do it that way versus having it attached at the underarm of the armscye. This is one of the more complicated outfits, and there are really no instructions. There's a lot of notes about how the original garment was made, but there's no instructions about what order do you do things in. And there's no instructions on how to put in a sleeve. You just have a sleeve and you have to put it in. So I think the thing that's helping me is that I've sewn a lot in the past and I've sewn a lot of sleeves. One of the things that is really helpful when putting in a set-in sleeve without having a bunch of puckers and gathers at the top is to run 2 rows of basting stitches around the top of the sleeve. And then you can pin it in on the underarm, right down in here, up to the point where it starts to have too much fullness to set in nicely. And then you can pull at those gathering threads to kind of ease that fullness into the armscye. but you needed to have 2 rows of gathering stitches in order to make it really be nice and flat. And then once you sew it, you just go slow, and you can always unpick a little section if it gets a wrinkle in it, and smooth it out and re-sew it. And then when you steam it at the end, all of those puckers and wrinkles kind of just fall away. So it's really nice. I'm going to show you though real quick the process of doing a sleeve. So I did mark on this sleeve a couple of spots. I made a few snips of where I knew that I needed to start the gathering stitches based on the last sleeve that I did. I'm going to put this on the longest stitch length that I have, which is 5. And I'm going to sew right along the very edge. Do not backstitch, but I'm going to sew right along the very edge of this sleeve cap. This will be the first row of gathering stitches. And you do want all of these stitches to be within the seam allowance. You can pull them out afterward if you need to, but if they're within the seam allowance, you don't have to. So I'm going to leave a long tail. I did not backstitch at the beginning or at the end. And now I'm going to go back and do another row just under the first row. So now I can just pull very gently on these gathering threads and start to ease in some of the sleeve cap. And then when I pin it in, you'll see in just a minute how nicely that will lay around the top of the armscye. And then when you stitch it, it'll be nice and smooth on the outside. So that's a step that you do not want to skip if you are setting in sleeves. Okay, here's where I'm going to start pulling. So now it's smaller than the opening, so I'm going to start pulling out some of that fullness. Just about have it. And the interesting thing is it looks like it's going to be gathered when you sew it, but it's kind of like magic. It just doesn't. And I'm going to just go very slow. I'm going to start under the arm. It's the moment of truth when you find out if your sleeve is even or not. And that looks really good. So you can see there's a little bit of a pucker up here, but once I steam that over a tailor's ham, that's going to be gone. But everything else looks nice and neat. And it's just like a little sewing miracle. I don't know how it works, but it works every time. So this is the first time I've put it all together with the sleeves and the under waist and the gown. Oh dear. My husband said it looks like a choir robe, and I have to say, I think he's right. But I am, as I said before, I am going to take out some of this fullness here because there's a lot of it. And this has to be ironed all the way down. I think that'll help a lot. And I have to make a belt. So the belt will go like round about here. And that'll help, to give some definition to it. But dear, oh dear, it looks like a potato sack. And up close, see, there's this really pretty, pattern in here with a little bit of red and some details. So, and it's much warmer than it looks like on screen. So I just don't know. I just don't think the 20s are my thing. But I'm so proud of myself for figuring out how to actually make it work. So here's the cuff that's not actually a cuff. So that's nice. And all of my edges are enclosed, so it's nice and neat inside and out. My sleeves went in really well. I'm happy with those. I'm even happy with how the pattern matching ended up. Not everywhere,
you know, obviously, like here you can't, it's not really matched.
The belt's really interesting because it has this texture of these little sections that have braid in them. I searched my stash for something that would match. I didn't have any brown, which probably would have been a better choice, but the fabric had this little strip of red in it, and this is actually a perfect match, even though it's kind of bright. It was supposed to have 12, and I dropped it down to 9 because I think 12 was just too red, and 9 allows some of that other fabric to show through. The other thing I did was I cut up some stitch witchery, so it's this fusible tape, and I just cut one piece the length of my fabric and then cut that in half, and I just laid it along the edge of the fabric like this and laid my braid pieces over it, and then ironed it down using some freezer paper so that it wouldn't stick. And then once I had it fused, I was able to do a line of basting stitch. This is within the 1/2 inch seam allowance, so nobody's going to see that stitch witchery, and that is the easiest thing I can think to do. So it gives me a lot more control, and yeah, I think this is going to be okay. Here's the finished belt. The red is a little bright, but I think it turned out okay, and I was able to sew this entire dress from my stash, so that's great. There are 8 decorative buttons on the belt. The 4 on the right-hand side are sewn down, and the 4 on the left-hand side are over some snaps, and that's what allows you to take it on and off. I graded up the dress pattern, but I did not increase the size of the belt, so that's why I sewed them on the very edge like you see here. I was sure it wouldn't fit, but in the end, the belt was fine, and I had to re-sew those buttons and snaps multiple times. And I still had to pin it for the final pictures. Make sure you know where you want this to fall on your hips before you sew the final closure. So that's it. That's the finished project. And I really liked this process of trying to puzzle out how to put together this complex dress with basically no instructions. It was a lot of fun for me. Yes, I made mistakes, but that's part of the learning process. And I don't think that the mistakes I made take away from the dress at all. I think the dress is fine just as it is. I'm really pleased with the result in the end. And as you can see from these pictures, it really does not look like a choir robe, and it doesn't look like a potato sack. It's actually very lovely on, much lovelier than I thought it would look on me. This is the most complicated thing I think I've ever made, but also it's the most clothes-like. I've sewn a lot of theatrical costumes, and of course there's a continuum of theatrical costumes. There's Broadway and all of the beautiful work there, and like people like Red Threaded that do amazing theatrical costumes. And then there's me. We don't have much budget. We're trying to put stuff together with very little time or money. And so there's a continuum on theatrical costumes. The thing about theater though is you don't have to have things made like clothing. You just have to have it made good enough to make it work on stage. You have to convey a sense of time and place with the silhouette. It doesn't have to be historically accurate, and frankly, it doesn't even have to last beyond the production itself. So if you have a wonky seam or something's just barely sewn in there, that's okay, because you're just gonna wear it on stage and nobody's gonna be close enough to tell anyway. So I've done a lot of that kind of sewing. I have not done a ton of making actual wearable clothing. So I do alterations and things like that, but it's very rare that I actually sew a garment from start to finish that I intend to wear as everyday clothes. So it was really fun to put that kind of time and effort into this. Even though it's a historical costume for me, it's made like clothing. I don't know why that's eye-opening to me, but it is. As I said in my other video, these weren't costumes for the people who wore them. They were real clothes. They had to look nice and they had to fit well. They couldn't get away with something just kind of slopped together. They needed to have a certain amount of structure and integrity in order to last as everyday clothing. So that was a lot of fun to actually take on a project that is this complex and to make it to a standard that would hold up for everyday wear. Anyway, I'm going to show you real quick how all the pieces go together. My dress form is not the size of me, and I'm not going to put this on camera. Sorry. So you're going to have to just put up with this. But basically, this is a belt, and it snaps on the side, and then you can pull it off. And then this is a jumper, and I'm going to pull that off. And here's the underwaist. This is a stomacher that goes across the opening and snaps. So this placket goes down the front and it has hooks and eyes. And then the sleeves are attached to this underwaist. So it's a three-piece garment, and the original garment was kind of tacked together. So this outer jumper was tacked to this, and then there were some snaps along the side of the jumper. I just left them as separate pieces because it's really easy to pull this over my head, and it just, to me, it was easier to construct, it's easier to wear. Thanks for joining me today. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you like what you see here, be sure to subscribe so you don't miss another one. See you next time.